Hey guys, this is Terry coming to you again today. I want to talk to you about a subject that I am pumped about. I have been studying this subject for the past 2 years and it is phenomenal. And it has to do with what did the giving system look like under the old covenant, mainly tithing. And I promise you, if you stick with me, you're going to learn stuff that you have never heard before. I'm 62 years old and I've never heard anyone teach on this topic, and I wonder why. Most of Israel was an agricultural community, and tithing only consisted of produce of the ground and herd animals. And the produce of the ground were basically your grains and your fruits, and the herd animals consisted of your cattle and your sheep and your goats. So it was only produce of the ground. If you had any other occupation in Israel, besides being a farmer, if you were a fisherman like Peter, James, and John, or you were a carpenter like Jesus and his family, if you were a doctor or you were a lawyer and you made money off of those professions, you were not required to tithe that money because tithing was only produce of the ground and herd animals. There were only 3 tithes in Israel, which we're getting ready to take a look at that. But hey, stick with me. I promise you, you're going to learn stuff you've never heard before. Okay, so I told you that there were only 3 tithes in Israel, and some people debate about how they're broken up, but basically your first tithe was your Levitical tithe, and that was for the servant Levites, not the priest. We're going to see all this, and it's in Numbers chapter 18, but the first tithe was the Levitical tithe. The second tithe was the festival tithe. Y'all gonna like this one. The festival tithe had to be eaten in Jerusalem before the Lord. So they took their tithe to Jerusalem and ate it before the Lord during the festival tithe. The third year was called the third year of tithing, or the year of tithing. And it was every third year the tithe went to the poor. So every third year the tithe was given to the poor. And every 7th and 50th year, there was no tithing. God said the land is to rest. Okay, here in Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, it's talking about the first tithe, the Levitical tithe. And I'm going to break this down a little bit more in detail, but this is just going to be kind of overview. In verse 21 of Numbers chapter 18, and it says, "And to the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service, which they perform the service of the tent of meeting." So this is talking about the first tithe, which is the Levitical tithe. Okay, in Deuteronomy chapter 14, it talks about the second tithe, which is the festival tithe. And y'all going to think this is interesting. This is the tithe that they had to take to Jerusalem and eat it before the Lord. And in verse 22, it says, "You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. And you shall eat it in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name." So you'll see this a bunch where it says that you're going to eat the tithe at the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. And that's going to end up being Jerusalem. It says, "The tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, the firstborn of your herd and of your flocks, in order that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." And then it says, this is interesting. It says, "If the distance is so great for you that you are not able to bring the tithe, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you when the Lord your God blesses you." So we're going to learn that the Levites lived in 48 Levitical cities that surrounded Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was not a Levitical city. So that when the Levites had to come from their city and travel to Jerusalem for the second tithe, he said, if the distance is too far away for you to bring all your food and your animals, then it says in verse 25, "Then you shall exchange it for money and bind the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses." So he's saying if the distance is too great, you may take your tithe and you can turn it into money And then you can make the travel from where you are to Jerusalem with your money. But get what they have to do when they get there. It says, and you may spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, for sheep, or wine, or strong drink, or whatever your heart desires, and there you shall eat it in the presence of the Lord your God, and rejoice, you and your household. So he says, if the distance is too far, you can turn your tithe into money and then make the trip. And then when you get to Jerusalem, you're basically taking your money and buying the food. You're buying your tithe back. But he said, you can spend the money on whatever your heart desires. They could take their tithe money and buy wine and strong drink. I was like, that's crazy. But hey, it's in the word here. And also, you shall not neglect the Levite who is in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance among you. So we're going to learn that when God was dividing up the land, and he chose the tribe of Levi to be his servants in the temple, that they got no land inheritance. So God was very concerned that the Levites we're going to eat just like everybody else. So that's why it says when you come to Jerusalem and you exchange your money and you turn it back into food or wine or strong drink, he says the Levite is going to eat also. So that is the festival tithe. Okay, and the third tithe, which is the year of tithing, which happened every third year for the poor, it picks up in the same chapter at verse 28. And it says, at the end of every third year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year and shall deposit it in your town. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien and the orphan and the widow who are in your town shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So every third year, the tithe was stored up in the city gates, and it was for the poor. And you'll notice also that a lot of times when it lists the poor, it always starts off with the Levite. So because the Levite had no land inheritance, they were poor. If you didn't have land inheritance in Israel, you were poor. And this third year was for the poor, and it's for the Levite, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. It says, they shall come and eat and be satisfied. So God was very concerned that the poor will eat just like everybody else. And these are the only three tithes in Israel. And then, like I said, in the seventh year, there was no tithing. God said, the land shall rest. Okay, I want to also show you something about first fruits, because first fruits was another type of offering. And you'll often hear in church that the tithe is the first fruits. And that is incorrect. The tithe has nothing to do with first fruits. The first fruits was a total separate gift. And in Leviticus 23, verse 9, it says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land which I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, then you shall bring up the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord for you to be accepted. So the first fruits was with the grain, it was only a sheaf. So they took one sheaf out of the field, took it to the temple, and offered it to the Lord. So the first fruits was a very small portion of the produce. And then over in Deuteronomy chapter 26. And in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 1 and 2, it says, then it shall be when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, and you possess it and live in it, then you shall take some of the fruit of all the produce of the ground which you shall bring in from your land that the Lord your God gives you, and shall put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. So here it says the fruit that you're going to offer as first fruits could fit into a basket. So there again, the first fruits is a very small portion of the produce of your ground, but it was the first that you offered. But the first you offered of the grain was the sheaf, and the first you offered as the fruit would fit into a basket. And then later on it says that the people back home, they could not eat any of the produce until this first fruit had to be offered. And we're going to see that the first fruits has nothing to do with tithe. Okay, now we're going to see how God divided the Levites for their service in the temple. God, out of all the 12 tribes in Israel, God called the tribe of Levi to be his priest and to serve him in the temple. But of the tribe of Levi, he called Aaron to be the priest and his kids. And so if you were a descendant in the lineage of Aaron, you were a priest. That's where the term the Levitical priesthood comes from. So if you were from the lineage of Aaron, you were a Levitical priest. Then God says all the other families of Levites that in the tribe of Levi, he says, I'm going to give them as servants to the priest. So every other family in the tribe of Levi, they were given as servants to the priest to serve Aaron and the priest in the temple. All right, so the priest had certain duties and places they could go, and the servant Levites had certain duties and places they couldn't go. So Aaron and the priest, they were the only ones that could attend at the altar and go within and behind the veil to where like the Holy of Holies was. They were the only ones that could offer the sacrifices on behalf of the people. And there were places that the servant Levite, if the servant Levites went to the altar and behind the veil, God said that they would die. And he even told Aaron, he says, if you allow them to do this, they're going to die and I'm going to kill you. So God was very, very particular about where you went in the temple. So the priest could serve at the altar. They did all the sacrifices and stuff. Well, what did the servant Levites do? Well, they served the priest. They were your singers. They were your worshipers. They were the temple guards. They did maintenance on the temple. They were over the storehouse. So anything that pertained to the temple, the servant Levites took care of. All right? Well, God says the Levites have no land inheritance. So when the children of Israel were going in to possess the land, and they were throwing out the people and basically taking over the land so they could live in it, God said, Levites, you have no land inheritance. And if you basically had no land inheritance, you were poor. So God had to make provisions of what did the priesthood get food-wise, and what did the servant Levites get food-wise. And in Numbers 18, it gives us a list of everything that the priests got. And they got the best of the best. And this is just a list of what they got. They got the grain offerings, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings, the wave offerings. They got the fresh oil, wine, and the grains. They got the first fruits. They got every devoted thing. They got the firstborn of man and animal. And also, they got 1% of the tithe. That we'll see that in a few minutes. So this is what the priests got for their service in the temple, because they had to have food to live on. Well, in Numbers 18, what did the servants leave? They had to have something to live on. Well, in Numbers 18, it says the servant Levites got all the tithe in Israel. So the servant Levites got all the tithe. The priests got all this. But we're going to see about this one. Okay, this is Numbers chapter 18, where it's talking about the division between the priesthood and the servant Levites, and it is important to know this for later on. And here it just says Aaron with the priesthood, but he says But bring with you also your brothers, the tribe of Levi, the tribe of your fathers, that they may be joined with you and serve you while you and your sons with you are before the tent of testimony. And then down in verse 6, it says, I myself have taken your fellow Levites from among the sons of Israel. They are a gift to you, dedicated to perform the service for the tent of meetings. But you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything concerning the altar and inside the veil. So here it's showing that the Aaron has been given the priesthood, but they attend to the altar and everything inside the veil. But the servant Levites are giving as servants to the priests. And like I said, they were your gatekeepers, they were your singers, your worshipers. And in chapter 8, it just goes through and lists all the things that I had put up on the board that the priest get. It says, these shall be yours from the most holy gifts reserved from the fire. Every grain offering, sin offering, guilt offering, and all the offerings that I listed. You're going to get the best of the fresh oil and all the best of the fresh wine and the grain, the first fruits. The first fruits from their land shall be yours. So this is just a list of what I've already put up on the board that the priest get. But then we come over here to verse 21, and it says, and to the sons of Levi, that is the servant Levites, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service which they perform, the service in the tent of meeting. So here, like I said, it is very important for you to understand what the priest get and what the servant Levites get. And the servant Levites get all the tithe, but the priest get everything else. In verse 24, it is continued. It says, for the tithe of the sons of Israel, which they offer as an offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites, that's the servant Levites, for an inheritance. Therefore I said concerning them, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, moreover, you shall speak to the Levites, that's the regular Levites, and say to them, when you take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. See this term, a tithe of the tithe? So what's going to be happening is when the sons of Israel bring the tithe to the servant Levites, then the Levites are going to have to tithe on what they got to the priest. So that's the tithe of the tithe. And then it says, so you shall also present an offering to the Lord from your tithes which you receive from the sons of Israel, and from it you shall give the Lord's offering to Aaron the priest. So this is the tithe of the tithe. Okay, before I get back to that tithe of the tithe where the servant Levites have to tithe on the tithe that they got to the priest, I wanted to show you this right quick. In Joshua 21, it talks about the 48 Levitical cities that surrounded Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was not a Levitical city. And these 48 Levitical cities, God commanded Moses to tell the children of Israel, because the Levites, like I said, had no land inheritance, but I already showed you that the food they got, the servant Levites got the tithe, but also he commanded that all the other tribes give the Levites cities to live in. And it says cities to live in with their pasture lands, because the Levites had to have somewhere to live. So this is just a little thing of the cities that surrounded Jerusalem, but Jerusalem was not a Levitical city, and you can read about that in Joshua chapter 21. Okay, this is in Joshua 21, where I just showed you where the tribes of Israel had to give the Levites cities to live in. And it says that they came to Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the household of the tribes of the sons of Israel. And they spoke to them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, saying, the Lord commanded through Moses to give us cities to live in with their pasture lands for our cattle. So the sons of Israel gave the Levites from their inheritance these cities with their pasture lands according to the commandment of the Lord. So why does it say pasture lands? Because the Levites had to have pasture lands to pasture all the animals that they received from the tithe, because they pretty much got one tithe a year. And that was enough food for them to live on the whole year. But then also we found out that the Levites got to eat at the festival tithe, and then also the third year of tithing was totally for the poor. Okay, so the Levites were giving cities to live in with their pasture lands. So pretty much if you were a Levite, you got free housing and free food for the rest of your life for your service in the temple, because you got no land inheritance. And when I was talking about the tithe of the tithe, so this is the way it worked out. So let's just say that this is the city of Dan, and the city of Dan had to give Levites houses to live in with their pasture lands. Even though they didn't own the home or own the land, they still had houses to live in, because they had to live somewhere. And that's what God commanded the children of Israel to do for the Levites. And there were 48 cities, but 13 of them were actually Levitical priest cities that the priests lived in. So what happened when the people from the city of Dan took their tithe to the Levites that lived in the cities, because the tithe was never taken to the temple. You always hear that the tithe is your first fruits, and the storehouse is the church, and you have to bring 10% of your money and put it in the storehouse. Incorrect. The way it worked under the Old Covenant, the tribes in the cities that they lived in, when they brought their tithe, they took their tithe to the Levites in the houses they lived in, and they gave them 10% of the produce of their land and their herd animals. And this is just a picture of the animals and the fruit, and like a servant Levites had. So they had to bring 10% of their produce and give it to the Levites. But guess what? The Bible says, which we're going to see in a minute, when they brought the tithe to the Levites, the priests were to be present. You say, why did the priest need to be present when the people brought their tithe to the servant Levites? Well, the priests were present because they were coming to get their portion. So their portion was, when the servant Levites got their tithe, then they had to tithe on what they got to the priest. And that's where the term the tithe on the tithe comes from. So they had to tithe 10% of the 10% they got. So if you do the math, the portion of the tithe that ended up to the priest was only 1. Because if you take 10% of 10%, you got 1%. So that's why earlier I showed you that the priest got the firstborn, the first fruits, the sin offerings, the guilt offering. They also got 1% of the tithe. So the priest portion of the tithe was only 1%. But get this. The Bible says that when the priest received the tithe, their 1%, from the Levites, that the Levites and the priests had to take the priest portion of the tithe to the temple and deposit it in the storehouse. So the only portion of the tithe that ever made it to the storehouse was the priest portion, which was 1%. And I'm getting ready to show you that in Jeremiah. Hold on. Okay, I said Jeremiah, but it's actually in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 10, it says that this is Nehemiah when he has come back to Jerusalem to try to get things back in order after they had been in exile. It says that we placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. So this 1/3 of the shekel that they contributed, it went to stuff. It went for like the showbread. It went for the wood. It was for the first fruits and just all the stuff that they had brought. And I don't think I mentioned that the priest, most of the stuff that the priest received, the food and stuff, was brought to the temple. Because if someone had to bring like a guilt offering, they had to bring the animal to the temple for the priest to offer on their behalf. So a lot of the food that the priest got, they received at the temple. And like I said, they only received 1% of the tithe, and that had to be deposited in the storehouse. But the other part of the tithe went to the Levites in the 48 Levitical cities that they lived in. It says, we will also bring the first of our dough, our contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, and the oil to the priest at the chambers of the house of our God. And get this, this is important. And the tithe of our ground to the Levites. For the Levites are they who receive the tithes in all the rural towns. So, who got the tithe? The servant Levites. Where did they bring the tithe? In all the rural towns. Those are the 48 Levitical cities that the Levites lived in. And when the children of Israel brought the tithe, they took it to the Levitical cities and gave it to the Levites who lived in all the rural towns. Okay, and this is when the priests are going to be present because they're coming to get their portion. And it says, and the priest, the sons of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithe. And the Levites shall bring up the 10th of the tithe. That's the tithe on the tithe. That is the 1% that the priests get. The Levites shall bring up the 10th of the tithe to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. So here it is showing that when the children of Israel brought the tithe to the servant Levites, they took it to the rural towns that they lived in. They didn't take it to the temple. The priests were present. And then when the priests were present, the Levites had to give the tithe of the tithe to the priest. And then it says, they shall bring up the 10th of the tithe to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. So back here, we just read in Nehemiah, when the children of Israel bring the tithe to the servant Levites and all the rural towns, the priests show up and they get the tithe of the tithe, which is 1%, and that 1% is taken and deposited at the storehouse in the temple. So the only part of the tithe that ever made it to the storehouse was the priest's portion of 1%. And now we're getting ready to blow Malachi chapter 3 slam out of the water. So we're bringing this thing to a head. Malachi chapter 3 that you hear probably almost every Sunday in church when the pastor gets up or somebody says, hey, it's time to receive our tithing offering. And you have to give 10% of your income to the church, and that is the storehouse. It is ridiculous that someone would actually stand up and try to tell you that if you don't give 10% of your income to the church, you're under a curse and you're robbing God. That is utter ridiculous. How in the world could a pastor stand up and try to bring a new covenant congregation back under the law and put them under a curse because they don't tithe? It is utter ridiculous. I tell people, I say, if you can find me one scripture under the new covenant where we're commanded, where the new covenant church is commanded to give 10% of our income to anybody, I'll give you a $100 bill right on the spot. Just show me one verse. That's all you got to do. Show me one verse under the new covenant where we're commanded to give 10% of our income to anybody. You'll get a brand new crisp $100 bill right on the spot. But save your time. You're not going to find it because it's not there. But we're going to see what Malachi chapter 3 really means. Like I said, I'm 62 years old and I've never heard anyone teach this subject. You're getting ready to hear the truth about Malachi chapter 3. Here we go. Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me, but you say, how have we robbed thee? In tithes and offering. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation, of you. And that of you is important because what that's referring to is the priest are the ones who are robbing God, because Malachi has been rebuking the priest in chapter 1, chapter 2, and he's rebuking them in chapter 3 for their corruption. So this should read, you are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation, of you priest. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. What did we learn was the only portion of the tithe that ever made it to the storehouse? It was the priest portion, which is 1%. So the priest portion of 1% is the only part of the tithe from the people that ever made it to the storehouse. So when God is rebuking the priest in Malachi, and he's saying, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, he's referring to the priest portion of the tithe, which is 1%. So if a preacher wants to stand up and say, hey, it's time for you to give us 10% of your income and deposit it in the storehouse, because you know Malachi, it says if you don't do it, you're under a curse and you're robbing God. We'll just stand up and say, hey, preacher, if you want me to follow Malachi like it is under the old covenant, instead of me writing you a 10% check, I'm going to write you a 1% check, because that's the only portion that ever made it to the storehouse. And I can promise you, like I said, I'm 62 years old and I have never heard anyone preach the truth about Malachi or this whole topic of what the Levitical system of giving, mainly tithing, looked like under the old covenant. So guys, I hope you've learned something. I mean, there is so much more information with this topic, but I just tried to cover it as fast as I could. But please, don't ever let any pastor or anybody tell you you're under a curse if you don't give 10% of your income to the church. Like I said, it's ridiculous. They're trying to take you back into an old covenant law and try to put you back up under the law. The only type of giving and the only way of giving that the new covenant teaches is 100% free will offering. You give as you have determined in your heart to give, not under compulsion or not of necessity. Give free will, and when you give free will, it becomes a heart issue. When you attach a percentage to it, you're drugged back under the legalistic system of the law. But somehow, people like to take Malachi under the law and somehow morph it over into the new covenant and say, oh, see, Malachi said we had to tithe. That means we have to tithe in the new covenant. No, it didn't. That's ridiculous. And then people say, well, tithing was before the law. And they use Melchizedek. Abraham tithed spoils of war to Melchizedek. Oh, I wish I could go into this stuff. I mean, it is so fun, so much more information that I could share. But for some reason, just because Abraham tithed spoils of war tithe to Melchizedek, somehow that it makes it mean that we have to tithe 10% of our income to the church. That's ridiculous. Hey, what else was before the law? Circumcision was before the law. Circumcision was a part of the law. Did it carry over into the new covenant? No, it specifically says that you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. How about animal sacrifice? Animal sacrifice was before the law. Animal sacrifice was a part of the law. Did animal sacrifice carry over into the new covenant? No, it didn't. Marriage was before the law. Marriage was a part of the law. Marriage carried over in the law. Clean and unclean foods. Clean and unclean foods were pre-law. Clean and unclean foods were a part of the law. Clean and unclean foods were abolished under the new covenant. Tithing, forms of tithing, spoils of war, and Jacob's tithe it was a conditional tithe. But spoils of war is actually under the law. If you want to read Numbers chapter 31, that's a very disturbing but phenomenal chapter. You don't have to wrestle with it when you read it. But it talks about the spoils of war tithe and how it was divided up amongst the people. And you'll find out that the spoils of war tithe, 0.1% of the spoils of war was given to the priest, and 1% of the spoils of war were given to the servant Levites. So how can you take Abraham tithing 10% spoils of war, but in the law, it was only 0.1% to the priest and 1% to the Levites? And then somehow you take that and try to find it over in the new covenant. That's why I said, I'll give you a $100 bill if you can find me one scripture that anywhere in the new covenant we're commanded to give 10% of our income to anyone. The new covenant only teaches free will offering. You give as you have determined in your heart to give. And when it's a heart issue, that is a new covenant command. It's not actually a command. It's a highly and you should give. You're crazy not to give. And there's a whole other teaching I have on actually giving under the new covenant. But hey, like I said, I don't know how long I've gone, but I could talk for another hour or two because there is so much more information that I didn't get to share because of time. But I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, share it and like it and get the word out. But hey, don't let anyone ever put you under any condemnation and tell you you're under a curse if you don't give 10% of your income to the church. Thank you.